Hello, everybody. I am Karen Bryla McNeese, dietitian with UK Health and Wellness. This is a fantastic crowd we have here today. So, thank you to everybody for being here. And thank you, Terry, again for coordinating this session on Mind Diet and inviting me once again to talk about this really exciting topic. I've been giving this talk on Mind Diet for quite a while. And it's interesting to me that every time I present on it, more and more people have heard of it. It's also a diet that, if you follow, kind of some of the consumer publications such as U.S. News and World Report, they have like their annual ranking of diets, and the Mind Diet has worked its way into the usually about top three of their diet rankings every year for the past few years. So it's definitely gaining traction, and it's gaining traction in ways that go beyond even kind of cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease, which is also interesting. So we'll talk about all that as we work through this. But again, thank you for choosing to spend some time to be here today. One of the things I do want to say about the Mind Diet, and this probably goes for a lot of things in the nutrition world, is that the headlines tend to outpace the research. There is usually a lot more hype in the popular media, consumer media, social media. A lot of hype that is not necessarily always warranted for the evidence that we actually have about these things. And the Mind Diet is no exception. Okay. Again, I think because it just kind of came on the scene about 9 years ago and seemed really promising and exciting for a lot of reasons we'll talk about, it just really took off. But again, some of the possible benefits it may have I think been possibly overstated at this point in the coverage. So again, we'll clarify some of that. And again, just to clarify, the Mind Diet was basically came on the scene in 2015. So it's less than 10 years old. That's still pretty new. That's really what we would call, being in its infancy in terms of literature and research. So we're going to be, it would only be prudent to kind of approach today's discussion with that in mind. Okay? So MIND is an acronym. It stands for Mediterranean Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay. Okay, basically minimizing or preventing cognitive decline, and as we'll talk about specifically, possibly lowering risk for Alzheimer's disease. Okay, so like I said, the Mind Diet was born, really just less than 10 years ago. And the logic behind it was this. If as we age, we know that the physical structure of the brain deteriorates and affects cognition. Okay, and this gives rise to a variety of symptoms such as forgetfulness, decreased ability to maintain focus, decreased problem solving capabilities. Okay, and what we know is that there's two diets, Mediterranean and DASH diets, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. Mediterranean DASH diets are known to lower risk for conditions that increase cognitive decline. What are these conditions? Diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease, to name the top three. We know that those chronic conditions are very much linked to cognitive decline. And we know Mediterranean DASH diets can help control those conditions. So that's kind of how this got started. But then the researchers, this came from Rush University in Chicago, Illinois. And the researchers there thought, well, geez, could we take kind of elements of the Mediterranean and DASH diet and combine them into a diet that would not only lower risk for cognitive decline, but also possibly prevent Alzheimer's disease, which is a certain type of dementia. And we know that people who do experience cognitive decline, this often precedes some, certain forms of dementia, again, including Alzheimer's disease. So I think a lot of folks are probably familiar with the Mediterranean diet, maybe less so with the DASH diet. But the Mediterranean diet reflects a way of eating that is traditional in the countries that surround the Mediterranean Sea, such as Greece, southern Italy, Spain. And the DASH diet that's also an acronym. It stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension, which is high blood pressure. So this is a diet that was created specifically to control high blood pressure. And it's interesting, again, we're talking about those conditions, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, right? That we know DASH, the Mediterranean diets, again, you've heard, I'm sure even in the headlines, help prevent and control those conditions. Now, I just gave you a brief snapshot here of the Mediterranean and the DASH diets in terms of what you would eat on a daily basis, what's recommended. And you can see that there's some differences, but there's a lot of commonalities, a lot of overlap. These diets are very plant-based in orientation. They do minimize red meats. They emphasize, whole, unprocessed foods, less added sugar, fewer foods high in saturated fat and added sodium. All the things that most of us probably familiar with, are hallmarks of a generally health promoting diet. Okay. So that's why these researchers thought, let's look at these two diets together. There's a lot of commonalities, but let's see if we can kind of pull out the elements that are most likely to, again, affect that cognitive decline and risk for Alzheimer's disease. I do want to say too, at this point, I know Terry has asked, as her and I discussed, to save your questions to the end, and we will have time for that. But if anything is unclear in terms of what I am talking about as we go along, please feel free to interrupt and put something in the chat box about that. Okay, I definitely don't want folks being confused about what we're talking about. Okay, so initial research with the MIND diet is reflected in this chart here. And this is really kind of where all the excitement began in terms of what could MIND diet do in terms of preventing Alzheimer's disease. Now, what they did with the MIND diet is they did not prescribe it. Okay, they basically came up with a point system to grade people's compliance with what they call the MIND diet, which we're going to look at what the elements of that are specifically here in a few minutes. But they used a point system, and then they ranked people's current diets based on low adherence, moderate adherence, or high adherence to the MIND diet. All right, and that's what you see here in these risk categories. Okay, so high adherence to the MIND diet was equivalent to a 53% risk reduction for Alzheimer's disease. Moderate adherence was 35% risk reduction for developing Alzheimer's disease. And they followed these folks over a several year period of time and looked at who did develop Alzheimer's and looked at their adherence to the MIND diet. What's really interesting too is that other research has shown that high adherence to the DASH diet or the Mediterranean diet will lower your risk for Alzheimer's disease. There are indications of that. But MIND diet appears to be the only diet where moderate adherence actually gives you also a significant reduction in risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. So what I take away from that is that the researchers in developing MIND diet seem to have isolated the dietary elements from each of the Mediterranean DASH diets that most affect Alzheimer's disease. So that's what made it really exciting initially. Okay. What's also interesting to note is that the results held, these results here in risk reduction, even when you control for factors such as genetic predisposition. These are common questions people might ask. Well, geez, what about if you're genetically predisposed? But they controlled for that, age, gender, education level, calorie intake, physical activity, and participation in cognitive stimulating activities, maybe like doing crossword puzzles and things like that. Okay. So yeah, these held even controlling for differences in those factors. The other thing, I'm going to go back a second because I had just another note while we were talking on that slide. What they also noticed, I think, in some subsequent research on the MIND diet is that the brain develops, normally when we have cognitive decline, develops abnormal clumps of proteins in the brain. This is often a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease, or the beginning stages of it, these abnormal clumps of protein. What's interesting is that the MIND diet can actually preserve cognitive function and prevent clinical dementia, which is, in this case, the dementia is Alzheimer's. And they know this because they would look at people post-mortem and look at the brain scans, right? And see these abnormal clumps, but have, understood that when these people were living, they, were able to follow the mind diet and preserve that cognitive function and were never clinically diagnosed with a dementia such as Alzheimer's. So it's really interesting that they can see postmortem that they had these hallmarks in the brain, but as the person was living, that was not, apparent in terms of their cognitive function. Right? So the one thing I want to say about the research here, and this holds for most nutrition research. So please take this perhaps as a little lesson in consuming nutrition information in general, not just about the mind diet. But most nutrition research, including research on the mind diet at this point, is what we call correlation. Okay, correlation is when two things happen together, but you can't prove that one thing causes the other, right? So in this example for mind diet, we see that there's a, compliance to the mind diet and a reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease. So these things occur together, but we can't necessarily prove one causes the other, which is called causation. That is really hard to prove with human nutrition in disease outcomes for reasons you can probably imagine, right? You would have to kind of lock people away in a lab with very controlled circumstances and diets and lifestyle factors for a long time. And that's just not realistic and probably not ethical. So a lot of the research, most of the research we have to date about disease and nutrition is very correlational, honestly. And I love this little graphic because I think it shows people the danger of correlation sometimes. So, ice cream sales increase while shark attacks increase in summer months, but that doesn't mean that buying more ice cream means you cause more shark attacks. So that's just a way to kind of remember how correlation works. And we do want to be careful when interpreting results based on that kind of research. Okay, so let's get into a little bit more exactly about what is the mind diet. All right, when we're talking about the mind diet and how these, people were scored based on their compliance to it, what were they trying to comply to? Okay, and just so you know, as we go through this, I am going to send Terry a PDF of this presentation, so you will have everything that you see here, okay, sent to you afterwards, along with a link to this recording. So we start with well, hold on, let me give you a general overview of the types of things we're looking at here. A lot of the foods we see here are powerful antioxidants and powerful anti-inflammatory agents. That I say would the two hallmarks of most of the foods that you see promoted here with the mind diet. Okay, we talked about those abnormal clumps of protein in the brain that are the hallmarks of dementia or Alzheimer's disease. And these foods actually help preserve brain function by preserving brain synapses and neural connections. Okay, even again, when you do have those clumps in the brain. So whole grains, and these numbers next to each category of food indicates how many times a week you are advised to eat these foods. So whole grains, 21 a week, we divide that by 7 days, that's three times a day. All right. Berries, 2 times a week. We're going to look at these lists more in depth too. I know sometimes like people are like, oh, well, what kinds of berries or what are whole grains and specifics like that. We're going to look at that too. Beans, 3 times a week. Leafy greens, 6 times a week. So nearly every day. Poultry, 2 times a week. Nuts, 5 times a week. Other vegetables other than the leafy greens, about once a day. Fish, 1 time a week. And everybody's favorite wine here. Terry may notice this because she's seen me give this presentation a few times, but I recently added these little question marks here to the wine box. You see those little pink question marks? Because what's interesting is that wine was included in the first kind of iteration of my diet, but it has since been taken off in other iterations in research because we're really trying to be, I think, as a health profession, very careful about recommending any kind of alcohol intake to people. That's always what I said, even when this was on here and I presented my diet to people. I said, if you don't already drink, don't start drinking now. Just because you see wine on the mind diet, that is definitely not the intention. For some people, Having one glass a day of white or red wine may be beneficial, but I think what we're seeing is that we don't want to make this a blanket recommendation or part of a diet like the Mind Diet. And this really is a decision you need to make with your healthcare provider one on one, people who know your individual health situation better. Okay. So, yeah. So, right now, that's all I'm going to say about the wine. If you don't already drink, don't do it. If you do drink, one glass a day. And one glass a day doesn't mean saving all the glasses a day up for the weekend. That's not how it works. Just like you don't save all your pills for the week for to take one day in the week. That's not how it works. It's kind of like a medication. That's how we would view wine if you are drinking it. And we're going to use a lot of olive oil for cooking and dressings because of its protection for the brain. And then finally, there are some foods though to keep to a minimum. I mean, the Mind Diet, one of the reasons I like it is it's promoting a lot of foods, but there are some things that they do, say you should minimize. Red meat 4 times a week or less, fast food, fried food, and cheeses less than once a week. I'm going to pick a little bone with that. I always do every time I present this because I'm all on board with the fast food and the fried food, but the cheese, man, I don't know. I find that difficult personally in my diet to make cheese be something that's less than once a week. And it does for a lot of folks, especially if you're a vegetarian, perhaps cheese can be a valuable source of calcium and protein for you. So that one might feel a little tough for some folks. Butter or margarine, fewer than 7 tablespoons a week. So that's almost a tablespoon a day, still pretty generous. And pastries or sweets of any kind, less than 5 times a week. So again, still pretty generous, right? So you can kind of see, I hope you're starting to see that this is a pretty flexible type of eating plan. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. The Mind Diet, you might be looking at this and be thinking, well, are these the only foods I eat on the Mind Diet? Because that doesn't seem like it's enough food for a person, most people day to day. And you would be correct in that. All right. That the Mind Diet only provides about 900 calories a day. And most people need more than that. Okay. Quite a bit more. So you would fill in the rest of the Mind Diet or the rest of your diet with other healthy foods that are not specifically part of my diet. So that might include things like eggs. You may have noticed were not part of my diet. Yogurt, milk, other types of fruits that are not berries, things like that. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Okay, so at this point, I do want to kind of, dive a little deeper into what is specifically in each of these Mind Diet food categories. So whole grains, this is probably something you hear promoted a lot if you follow nutrition or trying to improve your own diet. Um, because I know carbs in general get vilified as a dietitian, trust me, I know that. But not all carbs are created equally. And things like whole grains that are high in fiber, low in added sugars, minimally processed, are excellent sources of fiber and macronutrients. Okay. So this is where you would want to get a good chunk of whatever carbohydrates you do eat. This would include whole grain breads, so like whole wheat bread or whole wheat pasta, whole wheat cereals like shredded wheat or Wheaties, whole grain crackers like a Triscuit or a wheat thin, brown or wild rice, also oats, popcorn, quinoa, buckwheat, bulgur, barley, millet, farro. There's even some other more ancient grains and lesser known whole grains that I could put on here, but these are probably most of the things people have heard of or tried before. And I did put these little asterisks here to let people know that there are several gluten-free options for whole grains if that is something that you are needing to do. Berries, it looks like, any of these berries could be part of the My Diet: strawberries, blueberries, raspberries, blackberries. But it seems to me that strawberries and blueberries were the most emphasized in the research so far to My Diet. But we do know berries are great for all those antioxidants and polyphenols that are in there that help protect the brain. Beans. So, and by this I don't mean green beans. That would be more of like the vegetable category we'll look at. But beans like black beans, navy beans, white beans, kidney, pinto, soy, garbanzo, or chickpeas, and lentils of any kind as well. Okay. The one thing it probably doesn't include is like authentic refried beans made with lard. As delicious as those are, probably does not include that form of beans. Leafy greens, And this might surprise people. The first thing listed on here is romaine lettuce. A lot of people think that that doesn't like count as a leafy green because it's not quite as green as these other things listed here, like spinach and kale. But it absolutely does count. So if you're someone who maybe finds it difficult to eat the more really green leafy ones, please know that that romaine is a perfectly good choice and counts in this category too. The only thing that doesn't count is iceberg lettuce. That because and you can kind of tell a lot of these foods, you can tell their nutrient content by their color, right? Like berries, the color of these berries indicates different types of, nutrients they have in them. Same goes for vegetables, same goes for leafy greens. The more green it is, usually the more packed it is with these micronutrients. So iceberg lettuce is pretty pale colored, so it is pretty low nutrient. Still a good source of fiber and water, but not as high nutrient as these other ones. So the poultry category generally includes chicken and turkey. Okay, preferably the white meat over the dark meat and with no skin and prepared without frying. Okay, it's unclear to me still if pork tenderloin is part of this or not. Some references say it is, some say it's not. But I think most of us know pork tenderloin is still a pretty lean type of meat, and it's certainly something you can enjoy on occasion. Nuts, okay, nuts of any kind, really. Sometimes I hear things from clients who say like, "Oh, well, I thought only, almonds and walnuts were the good nuts or something." I don't know where that comes from, but nuts in general are a good source of unsaturated fatty acids, which is something that's very good again for, your overall health and brain health. So anything you see listed here, peanuts, cashews, almonds, walnuts, pecans, pistachios, hazelnuts, Brazil nuts. Um, some nuts are quite a bit more expensive than others. Like peanuts usually are some of the cheaper nuts. And so if that's something that fits into your budget better and you enjoy, like by all means, feel free to do peanuts instead of almonds, say, which are typically a little bit more expensive. Vegetables, again, this is everything that's not like the leafy greens. I can't list them all here, but these are just some examples. One thing I do find, well, a couple things I find interesting about the vegetable list. It's a lot of the things you would expect to see, right? Like broccoli and carrots and green beans. But towards the bottom of the list, you see there potato, corn, peas, lima beans. These are what we call the starchy vegetables. Now, botanically, they still grow like vegetables, but they do have a higher starch content. Okay, so that's something to be aware of if you are kind of watching carbs or managing diabetes or something like that. But they still are very nutrient dense, especially again when you eat them in a unprocessed form. I don't think we're meaning tater tots and French fries. When I say potatoes, we're talking more about a baked potato or oven roasted potatoes. But these starchy vegetables are still good sources of nutrients and do count as vegetables. Okay. Fish. So we're trying to do preferably fatty fish. That is where most of the benefit of this category would come from. And that includes salmon, tuna. Those are probably the two most popular ones. Sardines, herring, anchovies, trout, and mackerel. Okay. A couple other things. I forgot to say something about vegetables, and I'm going to say it about the fish too. Frozen vegetables and canned vegetables also count in the vegetable category. I should have said that about the fruit as well. Now, you do want to be careful that any frozen or canned things you buy don't have extra sugar or sodium added, which is getting easier to find these days. But it just definitely makes it feel more doable. Sometimes people are like, I can't keep all this fresh stuff around and use it before it goes bad, or it's more expensive, or I feel like I wasted, or it takes more time to prepare. But please know that you can use frozen or canned versions. And you can also use canned versions of tuna and salmon. So you don't always have to buy it fresh, which can be kind of hard to do in Kentucky. It can be kind of expensive too when we're in a landlocked state like this. So definitely feel free to use the cheaper salmon and tuna that are going to be just as healthy and give you those omega-3 fatty acids that are the big benefit for brain health. Okay. So this is, again, you're going to get this on the PDF from Terry, but this is a really nice overview of what the Mind diet might look like in a week. So you can see that they've, been working in all those categories we looked at that are specific to Mind Diet, but also filling it in with things that were not on the Mind Diet, right? Like we have some eggs on here, we have some Greek yogurt and things like that. Okay. Um, so when I look at this, I feel like it's a lot of foods that most of us are already familiar with, may already eat and enjoy, hopefully. Um, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that and other reasons I like the Mind Diet. But hopefully, this gives you the sense that this is pretty kind of, normal eating for a lot of us. Now, I noticed they didn't really put any of those other things in there. Like they don't have any of those sweets that you can have sometimes and a little bit of that butter. And, they got a little red meat on here. But remember, you could add those things in there here and there as well. Okay, so just to get a little bit more specific about why I do like the Mind Diet, and I've alluded to some of this already. Um, One, you don't have to follow it perfectly to get the benefits. So remember at the beginning, we talked about that moderate adherence. You still had a 35% risk reduction in developing Alzheimer's disease. That was on a scale of 1 to 15 points. That's how the Mind Diet was scored. And those folks, I think, were scoring like the moderate adherence folks were scoring about 6.5 to like, I don't know, 11 or something like that on the scale. So, I mean, they were very moderate adherence in terms of like how they were following, the Mind Diet. So I love that you don't feel like, oh, I got to do all these things perfectly every week to get the benefits. If you're doing like probably at least half of it week to week, you're still getting some benefit. Okay. And I like that because people, when it comes to nutrition, tend to be very concerned about following a diet perfectly. I mean, the word diet kind of implies there's a lot of rules. In this case, that's not what my diet is. I think, like I said, it's very flexible. But I think people are always, they hear the word diet and they're like, oh, I got to do it perfectly, right? But you don't, not with the Mind Diet. As a dietitian, I'm always very concerned too about the sustainability of the diet for people in terms of being able to follow it long term. I mean, I think a lot of, folks here probably have some experience with, having followed diets that are very rule based and restrictive. And you can only maintain those kinds of things for so long before you kind of, give it up. And so the Mind Diet, again, is so flexible that I think it can be maintained long term by most people. It emphasizes, like I said, foods that many people already eat and probably enjoy. All right. Um, it's also, like I said, very plant based, nutrient dense, and emphasizes preparing food at home, which are all good things to do for a variety of health reasons, right? Including weight management, other disease prevention, energy levels, just general, kind of how we're feeling, quality of life things. All right. And what's interesting too is the Mind Diet now, like I said, the initial excitement was around cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease, but we're now looking at Mind Diet for other things like, does it help people with diabetes or heart disease? Because it makes sense that it would when we talked about kind of the birth of the Mind Diet. So we're looking at it as a way to, kind of, help with other chronic diseases too. And what we do know right now as well is the saying goes, what's good for the brain is good for the heart, and what's good for the heart is good for the brain. So a lot of the basic dietary advice you've heard for years about a heart healthy diet very much applies to protecting your brain as well, and as you have seen, incorporated into the Mind Diet. I also like that the Mind Diet foods are things you can easily find at any grocery store. You can find all those foods at a Walmart, at a Kroger, at a Meijer, at probably even an Aldi, maybe even at Target, probably. So wherever you shop, you should be able to easily find these foods. You don't have to be making special trips to like Whole Foods or something like that to access these foods. And it's also pretty budget friendly, especially from the perspective where we talked about, being able to use maybe frozen vegetables and canned tuna and salmon and things like that. It should be fairly budget friendly as well, which I know is something people are increasingly concerned about. And then finally, it focuses on what to eat. Again, like I said, remember that graphic we looked at with the things to eat every week, and then they had that little section of things to minimize. For the most part, the Mind Diet is about things to eat. And I feel like when it comes to nutrition, people are always getting this message of what should I not eat? Like we're always giving this message of like avoidance and restriction and don't eat this and don't eat that. And that feels awful, right? Like to get that message, it's so negative. And then, then you just kind of feel like you're just somebody's taking things away from you and you don't know, then you're left with thinking like, what do I eat? I don't know what to eat. Nobody's telling me that. They're just telling me what not to eat. And so I like the Mind Diet as a roadmap of kind of what to eat. And once you kind of focus on what to eat, a lot of the stuff that maybe we want to eat less of kind of by default gets pushed off of our plate and we eat less of, right? So I think it has a lot of benefits. It's much more, I think, empowering and proactive to focus on what to eat instead of what to avoid. I tried to brainstorm maybe some simple ways to start doing the Mind Diet. Like if you really were just like, I'm really excited about this. I want to start now. Like what are some things I could do kind of pretty immediately without a lot of time or effort to start doing that? One would be think about any grains that you are eating. If you are eating, white, highly processed, refined grains that aren't whole grains, maybe start experimenting to swap some of those out. Could you try whole wheat bread instead of white bread? Could you try whole wheat or bean-based pasta even instead of regular pasta? Could you do brown rice instead of white rice, right? Instead of eating saltine crackers, could you try some Triscuits? So simple things like that or easy swaps. Another swap would be using more poultry instead of beef. I'll be honest with you guys, the way beef has gotten more expensive, I have started using a lot more ground chicken and turkey in my diet because it's like half the price. And once you mix it in a dish, I mean, nobody really knows the difference in terms of whether it's beef or ground chicken or turkey. I'm kind of preferential to ground chicken, to be honest, over the turkey. But it is like half the price and just as much protein and maybe even a little bit healthier overall. So that's a great swap too. Um, have a salad with your meals. So remember those leafy greens, those are supposed to be almost every day. And so maybe you make it a habit to have a little side salad with your lunch or your dinner every day. Snack on nuts instead of chips, right? Maybe you're after something crunchy and salty. Chips are that for a lot of people, but maybe it could be, a little handful of nuts instead to give you that. Trying to use berries as a natural sweetener. So trying to maybe put blueberries or strawberries on your, unsweetened whole grain cereal like Cheerios or on your oatmeal so that you can use less or no sweetener. Use hummus or avocado, which again is going to be healthy fats and some beans with the hummus on sandwiches instead of mayo or cheese. So at this point, you're kind of swapping out more of those saturated, not so heart healthy fats and brain healthy fats with more heart healthy fats. Have a meatless dinner once a week. So that might force you to kind of maybe use some of those beans or lentils a little bit more frequently. And to get around the cheese issue again, because that just really bugs me. One recommendation is to try to use sharper cheeses when you're flavoring foods. So maybe using like an extra sharp cheddar. And a lot of times that a little bit will go a long way. So you might not have to use like a half cup in the recipe. You could just use like a sprinkling of it and still kind of get that cheese flavor that you're after. That's about as best as I've come up with on the cheese front, but all right. I also want to say, we don't want to forget about, I mean, I'm a dietitian, this is my area of focus, but I don't want to forget about other lifestyle factors that we do know are associated, correlated with cognitive decline. Okay. That would be smoking. That would be heavy alcohol use. Okay. More than like the one drink a day. Or sleep quality. We're seeing more and more how sleep quality and quantity is linked to a variety of increased health risks, but cognitive decline is one of them, and also a lack of physical activity. So, maybe you're feeling like, oh, my diet's actually already in pretty good shape. Maybe there's some of these other things you could focus on, or maybe you focus on one of these first and then move on to your diet. But just we want to be sure we're looking at this holistically as well. I thought you might find it helpful to have some of these resources. These are some cookbooks on the Mind Diet that you can easily purchase. I assume I found all of these on Amazon, but I assume that any bookstores that are still left, like Joseph Beth, you could probably go there and find at least one of these there. I have not checked, but yes, these are a good few that looked good to me, like for beginners and kind of having more of like a plan, or trying to do it on a budget. I thought these might be of interest to you. And then finally, there is a website. I put it here, minddietmeals.com. This is what the homepage looks like. But it's run by a registered dietitian like myself, who is keeping up to date with the Mind Diet research, creating recipes, and advice around the Mind Diet. So this is a fantastic resource free online that you can also access.